In the early hours of a quiet night, when most of the world was asleep and unaware of how close it stood to annihilation, a single man sat in a dimly lit control room beneath Soviet soil. He was not a politician, not a general with armies at his command, and not a world leader whose name filled newspapers. He was an officer following a routine shift, surrounded by blinking lights, humming machines, and screens designed for one purpose only: to warn of the end of the world. What happened during those minutes would never make headlines at the time, would never be announced to the public, and yet it may have saved humanity from total destruction. As you listen to this story, think about how fragile history truly is, and leave a comment sharing whether you believe one individual can change the fate of the world. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if stories like this matter to you, and write a comment related to this moment in history. Your interaction helps keep these stories alive and reaching more people. The year was 1983. The Cold War had reached one of its most dangerous points. Tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was thick, constant, and deeply personal on both sides. Nuclear weapons were not abstract threats discussed in theory. They were loaded, armed, and pointed, waiting only for a signal. Both superpowers lived under the doctrine that if one side launched, the other must respond immediately, without hesitation, because delay meant annihilation. Just weeks earlier, the Soviet Union had shot down a civilian airliner that had strayed into its airspace, killing hundreds of innocent people. The global outrage was immense. Trust between East and West, already fragile, had nearly evaporated. Military exercises were interpreted as potential invasions. Intelligence reports were filtered through fear. Every radar signal was suspect. Every anomaly carried the weight of catastrophe. Deep inside a Soviet early warning facility known as Serpukhov 15, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty. His job was simple in description and terrifying in reality. If the system detected incoming nuclear missiles from the United States, he was required to report it immediately to his superiors. That report would move up the chain of command within minutes, possibly seconds, leading to a retaliatory strike. Once that process began, there would be no stopping it. Shortly after midnight, the alarms shattered the silence. A warning light flashed red. The system indicated that a nuclear missile had been launched from the United States and was heading towards Soviet territory. The computer labeled the alert with a word no one ever wanted to see: launch. Petrov froze, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood exactly what it meant. According to protocol, one missile detection was enough to begin the reporting process. But then, seconds later, the system escalated. It now showed 5 incoming missiles. The screens confirmed it. The alarms grew louder. Every piece of technology in the room insisted the same thing: an American nuclear attack was underway. The officers around Petrov looked to him. The room was tense, filled with the kind of fear that tightens the chest and clouds the mind. Years of training told them that the system was designed to be reliable, that it could not afford to be wrong. The logic was clear. If they hesitated and the attack was real, millions would die without retaliation. If they acted and the alert was false, they would trigger the very apocalypse they were meant to prevent. Petrov's mind raced. Something felt wrong. A full nuclear first strike, he reasoned, would not consist of only 5 missiles. It would be overwhelming, massive, designed to cripple the Soviet response entirely. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. He also knew the satellite warning system was new, untested under real combat conditions and prone to errors. Yet none of that was written into the procedures he was sworn to follow. The pressure was immense. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, to decide. The fate of countless lives balanced on his judgment alone. Reporting the attack would align with protocol and protect him from blame. Declaring it a false alarm would violate orders and place responsibility squarely on his shoulders if he was wrong. As the alarms continued to scream and the countdown ticked forward, Petrov made a decision that would never appear in official Soviet reports at the time. He picked up the phone and calmly reported that the alert was a system malfunction. He told his superiors that no missile attack was underway. The room fell into a tense waiting period. Every second stretched endlessly. If Petrov was wrong, nuclear explosions would soon confirm it. If he was right, nothing would happen at all. The machines continued their warnings, but Petrov stood by his judgment, watching the clock, waiting for impact that never came. Minutes passed, then more. No missiles struck, no detonations followed. The screens eventually went silent. The alarms stopped. The system had been wrong. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had fooled the satellites into interpreting reflections as missile launches. In that moment, the world continued to exist, unaware of how close it had come to ending. But the consequences for Petrov were far from over, and the silence that followed this decision would shape his life in ways few could imagine, leading into what happened next. The silence that followed did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. Stanislav Petrov remained seated, staring at the darkened screens, fully aware that what he had done would not be celebrated. In the Soviet military structure, success meant following orders, not trusting intuition. Even though the catastrophe had been avoided, Petrov knew that questions would come and they would not be gentle. In the hours that followed, investigators arrived. Reports were written. Logs were examined line by line. Instead of praise, Petrov faced criticism. He had failed to properly document the incident. He had not followed protocol. The system, according to official doctrine, was never supposed to be questioned by a single officer, no matter how experienced. The fact that the system had been wrong was an inconvenience, not a triumph. The malfunction was eventually traced back to a rare alignment of sunlight, high-altitude clouds, and satellite sensors. The early warning system, still in its infancy, mistook reflections of sunlight for the exhaust plumes of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Engineers quietly corrected the flaw. The incident was classified. No medals were awarded. No public acknowledgement was made. Officially, nothing extraordinary had happened that night. Petrov returned to his life, carrying a burden no one around him could fully understand. He had held the future of the world in his hands, made a decision that defied the rigid logic of Cold War deterrence, and then watched the moment disappear into secrecy. The weight of that knowledge was isolating. He could not speak openly about it. He could not explain the sleepless nights or the lingering question that haunted him. What if he had been wrong? Meanwhile, the world above ground continued its dangerous dance. Military exercises intensified. Political rhetoric hardened. In Europe, NATO conducted large-scale simulations that the Soviet leadership interpreted as possible preparations for a real attack. Each side believed the other was capable of striking at any moment. The margin for error grew thinner with every passing month. What made Petrov's decision so extraordinary was not just that he doubted a machine. It was that he understood human behavior. He understood fear, strategy, and the psychology of war. Nuclear doctrine assumed rational actors responding predictably, but Petrov recognized that systems were built by humans, and humans made mistakes. Trusting a flawed system blindly, he believed, was more dangerous than trusting reason. Years passed. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. New generations grew up unaware of how close the world had come to destruction on multiple occasions. Petrov retired quietly. His life after the military was modest, even difficult at times. He received no special pension, no honors from his government. The decision that may have saved millions brought him no material reward. It was not until decades later that the story began to surface. Western journalists, historians, and former officials learned of the incident through declassified documents and interviews. When the world finally heard what had happened, the reaction was one of disbelief. The idea that global annihilation had been avoided not by treaties or armies, but by one man questioning a warning, challenged everything people thought they knew about security and control. Petrov was eventually invited to speak about the incident. He stood before audiences who applauded him as a hero. Awards were offered. Recognition came late, from places far from where the decision had been made. Yet Petrov himself remained reserved. He did not see himself as a savior. He often said he had simply done his job, using common sense when it mattered most. Still, the implications of that night extend far beyond one individual. The incident exposed a terrifying truth. The fate of humanity had been entrusted to systems that demanded instant obedience, leaving no room for doubt or reflection. If Petrov had been a different person, less willing to question authority, history might have ended differently. As technology advanced, early warning systems became faster, more automated, and more complex. Artificial intelligence, algorithms, and sensors took on greater roles in military decision-making. The question Petrov's story raises becomes even more urgent with time. When machines speak with certainty, who is brave enough to say they might be wrong? That night in 1983 was not the only time the world came close to nuclear disaster, but it was one of the few where disaster was avoided through restraint rather than escalation. The choice Petrov made revealed how thin the line truly is between peace and extinction, and how much depends on moments that never appear in history books. And yet, there is more beneath the surface of this story, more consequences and unanswered questions that continue to shape how nations prepare for war, how technology is trusted, and how silence itself can alter the course of history, leading us further into what this decision truly meant for the world that followed. The deeper consequences of that night remained hidden for years, buried under classified files and unspoken agreements. But within military circles, the incident quietly reshaped how early warning systems were viewed, even if no one admitted it publicly. Engineers became more cautious, redundancies were added, human oversight, though still constrained by doctrine, was acknowledged as a necessary safeguard against catastrophic error. For Stanislav Petrov, however, life did not become easier with time. The secrecy surrounding the event meant he carried the psychological weight alone. He struggled with the knowledge that his correct decision could just as easily have destroyed his career, or worse, had the outcome been different. In a system where obedience was valued above judgment, he had survived not because of his choice, but despite it. He later described the moment as one filled not with heroism, but confusion. He had not felt brave. He had felt uncertain. The alarms had been loud, the pressure overwhelming, and the fear very real. Yet what guided him was a simple thought. Something about the situation did not add up. That instinct, born of experience rather than instruction, proved more reliable than the most advanced technology of the time. This raises an uncomfortable truth about nuclear deterrence. The entire structure is built on speed, automation, and the assumption that machines can reduce human error. But the Petrov incident revealed the opposite. Machines can amplify error, and when combined with rigid protocols, they can remove the very human judgment needed to stop disaster. Historians later compared this moment to other near misses during the Cold War: submarine commanders who refused to launch, radar operators who hesitated, pilots who questioned orders. In each case, catastrophe was avoided not by design, but by individuals who paused when the system demanded action. These stories suggest that the survival of humanity has often depended on restraint rather than strength. What makes Petrov's case unique is how little margin for time he had. There were no long deliberations, no committees, no second chances. The decision existed in a narrow window measured in minutes. Once that window closed, the machinery of retaliation would have moved beyond any individual's control. As nations continued to modernize their arsenals, the lessons of 1983 remained largely unspoken. Official narratives preferred the idea that systems were foolproof, that command and control structures were flawless. Admitting vulnerability meant admitting that the end of the world could arrive by accident, misunderstanding, or a line of faulty code. In the years that followed, computer simulations revealed just how often false alerts occurred. Flocks of birds, weather anomalies, software bugs, and human input errors repeatedly triggered warnings. Most were caught in time, some were not. Each one represented a moment where the world briefly stood at the edge, dependent on calm judgment in the face of automated certainty. Petrov watched these developments from a distance. He lived modestly, rarely speaking publicly unless asked. Fame made him uncomfortable. He rejected the idea that he was extraordinary, insisting that anyone in his position might have done the same. But those who studied the incident disagreed. Training alone did not explain his choice. Character did. There is a quiet irony in the fact that Petrov's decision violated the very doctrine meant to protect his country. Deterrence relied on immediate response to prevent attack. By hesitating, he technically weakened that posture. Yet by hesitating, he preserved peace. The contradiction exposes a flaw at the heart of nuclear strategy. Survival may depend on disobedience. As the world moved into a new era, new powers acquired nuclear capabilities. Old rivalries faded, new ones emerged. Technology advanced beyond anything imagined in the Cold War. Decisions that once took minutes now take seconds. Automation reduced human involvement even further. The question that lingered from Petrov's night became more urgent, not less. Who watches the machines when machines watch the world? Who has the authority to say no when every system says yes? These questions remain unresolved, and they are not theoretical. They are built into the infrastructure of modern defense, silently waiting for another moment of crisis. Petrov passed away years later, his story still unknown to many. There was no global memorial, no day of remembrance. The absence of disaster leaves no scars, no ruins, no photographs. History often forgets what did not happen, yet the future continues to be shaped by that absence, by the lives that went on, by generations born because one man chose caution over certainty. And as we look closer at how this silent decision echoed through military doctrine, political thinking, and the philosophy of power itself, the true significance of that night becomes even clearer, opening the door to the final understanding of why no shot was ever fired, and why that silence mattered more than any explosion ever could. That silence, more than any display of force, reshaped how some thinkers began to understand power. True power, the incident suggested, was not found in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to refrain. Yet this idea clashed deeply with decades of military planning built on dominance, deterrence, and the promise of overwhelming retaliation. The world preferred to believe it was safe because systems were strong, not because individuals were thoughtful. Behind closed doors, strategists debated scenarios similar to the one Petrov faced. Some argued that removing human hesitation would make deterrence more reliable. Others quietly worried that doing so would guarantee catastrophe. Automation, after all, does not feel doubt. It does not question intent. It does not sense when something feels wrong. It only executes what it is told to do, faster and without mercy. The incident also revealed how fragile communication truly was during the Cold War. Lines between Washington and Moscow existed, but they were slow, filtered, and burdened by mistrust. In the minutes Petrov had to decide, there was no way to confirm intentions, no diplomatic channel fast enough to clarify a misunderstanding. The world relied on assumptions, and assumptions are dangerous when weapons of extinction are involved. What is often overlooked is how close the Soviet leadership itself was to expecting an attack. Intelligence reports at the time suggested that American rhetoric and military movements indicated possible aggression. Paranoia was not irrational in that environment. It was cultivated. Leaders were trained to assume the worst, because assuming otherwise could be fatal. Petrov's refusal to follow that mindset was an anomaly in a system designed to suppress anomalies. Psychologists who later studied similar crisis decisions noted something striking. Under extreme stress, most people revert to training. Petrov did the opposite. He stepped outside his conditioning and relied on logic and intuition. That choice required not only intelligence, but emotional control. Panic would have pushed him toward protocol. Calm allowed him to question it. This aspect of the story rarely appears in technical discussions of nuclear safety, yet it may be the most important. No safeguard is stronger than the mindset of the person using it. Technology can detect, calculate, and predict, but it cannot understand context the way a human can. It cannot weigh probability against consequence in a moral sense. Petrov did not calculate odds. He weighed outcomes. If he was wrong and did nothing, the Soviet Union would be destroyed without response. If he was wrong and reported an attack, the world would end by human decision. Faced with that imbalance, he chose the path that allowed time to reveal the truth. Time in that moment was the most valuable resource on Earth. As decades passed, the story slowly entered academic discussions, documentaries, and ethics debates. It became a case study in military academies outside Russia, often framed as a lesson in restraint. Yet even as it was studied, the systems that made such a moment possible remained largely unchanged. Nations continued to maintain hair-trigger readiness. Missiles stayed armed. Alerts stayed automated. The contradiction persists to this day. Humanity acknowledges, at least intellectually, that nuclear war would be catastrophic beyond comprehension, and yet it continues to build structures that could initiate such a war in minutes. The Petrov incident stands as proof that disaster is not always the result of malice. Sometimes it is the result of procedure. Perhaps the most unsettling element of the story is how easily it could happen again. Different technology, different countries, same logic, false data, compressed timelines, immense pressure, a human being forced to choose between obedience and judgment. The variables change, but the core risk remains. Petrov once remarked that he was in the right place at the right time, but that he wished no one ever had to be in that position again. That wish has not been granted. As long as nuclear weapons exist, similar moments are inevitable. The only question is who will be there when they occur, and whether they will have the courage to pause. The night of 1983 did not end a war, sign a treaty, or dismantle a missile. It did something quieter, and perhaps more profound. It exposed the truth that the survival of the world can depend on a single decision made in silence, without witnesses, without applause, and without certainty. And to fully understand why that silent decision mattered more than any battle ever fought, we need to look at what it teaches us about responsibility, fear, and the fragile balance that still defines our world today, which leads us directly into the final part of this story. The true significance of that night lies not in what nearly happened, but in what never did. No explosions, no sirens, no irreversible chain reaction. Stanislav Petrov's choice was not heroic in the traditional sense because it was invisible, quiet, and rooted in doubt rather than action, yet it may have preserved the future of humanity. By refusing to blindly trust a machine and choosing to pause instead of react, he demonstrated that restraint can be more powerful than force, and that responsibility cannot be delegated entirely to technology. His decision exposed a timeless truth that remains relevant today. Systems, no matter how advanced, are only as safe as the judgment of the humans who oversee them. World War III was not stopped by weapons, treaties, or threats, but by a single moment of calm reasoning in the face of overwhelming pressure, a moment that left no physical evidence, yet allowed the world to wake up the next day and continue existing, unaware that its survival had depended on silence.